My name is Taylor. I am here with Fraser Lypkie of Lypkie Law in Edmonton, Alberta. Thank you so much for joining us, Fraser. How's your day going today?
It's going good. So we're very happy to be able to have the opportunity to come and meet with you today. And it's a beautiful spring day in Edmonton. So can't wait to see the weekend and see kind of the snow melting around the city.
Absolutely. Actually, that's a fantastic time of year for us when we start to see the end of the winter. And it's also a pretty crazy time for real estate. Now, we call this segment our expert insight because you're one of our strategic experts here. And I'm with Hack& Company at Remax River City for anybody joining us new. And we often end up interacting with you because real estate is a really big part of your business.
Yeah, absolutely. We're luckily a second generation law firm. And my father, Ken, been practicing real estate since I was a kid. And then he eventually retired about 4 years ago now. And my brother, Tyler, and I have been running the practice ever since, and with a big focus on residential real estate. It's just one of those areas of law. Well, pretty much every client we ever run into is going to buy or sell a house at some point in their life. And so as a result, being a multi-service firm, we need to make sure that we can handle that for all of our clientele.
I really feel the same way. Like this is one of the larger elements of the business of being a family. And that's something that really a lot of people don't necessarily think about where lawyers are involved in their life. But honestly, if you've had any real estate transactions, you've essentially had interaction with a lawyer. You guys are the only ways to do it.
Yeah, essentially. And most of the time, people, when they're first buying a house, they don't really have any sort of connection to a law firm. They might talk to their parents, their grandparents, and get a referral. Talk to realtors, of course, like yourself, and sort of see where they need to end up. But at some point in time, you need a lawyer to sort of close that real estate transaction. And if we're able to help out early on in the process, we're always happy to chat with potential clients and get to know people ahead of time. But they'll end up needing us to close that transaction and answer any questions about their mortgage, real property reports, all sort of stuff like that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that this is kind of the introduction to like that next level of family business. A lot of people will end up buying their first property, and that's when it will be revealed to them that there are other elements that they need. Going through that first real estate transaction, it's interesting from my perspective because we essentially are the ones who make the promises on the front end. And it kind of comes down to everything like the rubber meeting the road in your office. So I really enjoy how much we collaborate. But what do you feel are the common pitfalls when those first time home buyers are going through the process?
Well, I think a lot of times it's expectations, especially with media and television. A lot of times people think, well, you put an offer on Monday and suddenly you got the keys Tuesday nights and everything is sort of teed up so quickly in between. So a lot of times I think clients as well, especially younger clients, are overwhelmed with the amount of paperwork they're getting into. They got to deal with a realtor, there's a mortgage broker, there's a refinancing, there's a lawyer, and usually every deal's got at least one little bump along the way. And there's definitely a lot of excitement when buying a house, and when there can be little struggles as we get to that closing date, that can generate a lot of anxiety. So obviously we're here to help with that, as are you. And for most people, I think the commonalities is just make sure that you try and deal with things in advance. Talk to people in advance. Sort of set your expectations, get a good sense of timeline. And then once people kind of know it's going to take a while till they kind of line all their ducks up in a row, get financing approved, deal with realtors and offers, they're usually a little bit more calm. But a lot of those first time calls we get from clients, they really think that they've only got 2 days to get everything done, when in reality there's a lot of time to get through the process.
I think that that's one of the biggest issues is not knowing.
Mm-hmm.
When they're engaging in the process, a big part of what our job is education. But we also find that we're educating people on different services that they can work with through the process, because I know that not every lawyer does real estate, and you need to have some really specific elements in place to do this well. So what I see is that the places that struggle with this are normally struggling with timelines. So
Mm-hmm.
keeping the trains running on time, knowing like when to check on documents if documents might be late.
Mm-hmm.
It's
Yep.
really tough if you're just reactive, and that's something that you guys do so well. And then the other side of it was that there's some things that are very specific to this type of law firm, right? Like I don't think anybody who doesn't practice real estate would have anywhere near the trust account that you guys would have.
Yeah, we're lucky enough that we have a very devoted client list, and we have a lot of people where we manage a large amount of trust funds. And as a result, we're very comfortable with the management of trust funds and getting everything to the penny. And also that does come in line with timeline, like you said, getting things done ahead of time, making sure we have an understanding what the timeline will be, and then what funds we're going to need in and what times. And if we don't front load our work, then we can sort of be scrambling at the end, which is why we like to know, when's deal closing, how much time do we have, what do we have to allocate resources for, focusing on review time for the files as well. Because even though the deal may close in 3 weeks or a week, making sure that we set down the proper amount of time for each individual file ensures that they get the attention that they deserve. Because a lot of people, this is the biggest transaction of their life, and a lot of hopes and dreams are pinned on that beautiful home. And so if it's not given that attention, I think particularly it will leave a lot of people unhappy, and justifiably so. So we like to make sure that we front load the work, as we like to call it, so that usually by closing, there's not a lot for us to do other than check our math and make sure everything is up to snuff. And we also make sure that we have an outside bookkeeper who helps us with all of our transactions, auditing what we do. So if there's ever a situation where, hey, you're off by a penny, it's like, well, we deal with that as well in advance as possible, because it just takes a penny for there to be a problem. But for the most part, we have very few problems when it comes to that sort of issue, which we're looking for.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's something that comes, I imagine, with experience and dealing with the volume of transactions that you do, because that's one of the things that we notice in having you as a trusted expert is the quality of work. Like, I don't know how many people you have read one thing before it leaves your office, but normally there's no concerns when it comes to that element. That's got to be actually something that many people couldn't see from the outside, is how much detail oriented work a law firm does. Like you were talking about down to the penny when, or also taking a look at some things where it's line by line to make sure that there's not a word out of place.
Yeah, and kind of going back to talk about my father, he used to tell me, especially when I was working early on in the firm, the devil is in the details. And it was sort of, you can do 99% of things correctly, make one small slip, and that really is enough to start just a massive headache. And we have always been very lucky, especially when working with realtors like yourself. When the contract comes in, the details are lined up, things are looking really good. It's when we get contracts where there are like little things, and even a comma out of place can change the whole intention of a sentence, and that can change sort of what the transaction is going to look like. But for the most part, we find that a lot of times when, again, we look at things in advance, those details come out pretty easily in the wash, and we don't have to worry about problems sort of rearing their heads at the last minute, which is nice.
That's super awesome. And we really appreciate that, because it is very different than what we normally see. So most of our lives, as we're kind of graduating towards that level where we're starting to partake in real estate, we do end up buying a few things of great expense. A lot of people will get their first credit card when they're around 18, and there's kind of responsibility and a new set of rules when it comes to that. And then maybe they get their first car somewhere along the lines, and that's the first like monthly obligation. And also, one of the largest pieces of business that people ever do without staff. But that's the big change, is up until that point, how often your work is checked is actually pretty little. So if you're maybe you're not very good at buying cars, but you think you are, and then all of a sudden you're engaging in real estate and getting advice from professionals, and we see some pretty wild negotiation techniques. And as trained negotiators, I always find that there's an education point to that, to talk about like how a victory is an agreement, but it's an influenced agreement. It's an agreement that has had pressure applied to see, from a buyer's perspective, to reveal the lowest price that a seller will pay. But that's something that I also find is a keen element to watching you guys practice law, is that really it's just like your dad was saying, it's so much prevention, right? Because the cure is really, there's not a lot of incentive around the cure.
No, and I would say that when people sort of they deal with things in advance of a legal problem, sometimes it can seem really frivolous, because we're saying, well, let's put in a bit of cost, bit of time, bit of effort to make sure that there is not a problem. And people say, well, what's the chance of that happening? It's probably going to be 1 in 1,000. And we see a lot of that with clients who they do try and retain services like Comfrey or Purple Bricks, and they don't want to get a professional involved. And they said, well, look, I have friends who did it correctly. It's probably going to be okay for me. And it probably is, on the majority of cases. But what we normally see in our line of work is that when the problems do arise, they're of significant magnitude. They're big, big issues. And so those preventative medicines, while sometimes can seem a little bit frivolous and it's probably covering a small chance, it's covering a small chance of a very big problem. Sometimes we've had clients call us and actually they sold their house twice. There's two different people they had accepted contracts with, and that's a pretty scary thing. And most of the time we're able to get them out of those issues. And those are situations, they didn't have a realtor, didn't have anybody helping them, but it's seemingly a small detail when you have two pieces of signed paperwork, because they
Those
thought maybe
two families will those two families will just live together, right, Fraser?
yeah, they'll just figure it out. One will be there on the weekends, one will be there in the
They'll do it like a
weekdays. But
timeshare.
yeah, absolutely.
They're not going
Very,
to be
very
upset,
expensive
right?
time. Those are odd things where we like to talk to clients in advance of problems, and it's something which most of the time we do, but it's pretty rare that we're the cleanup crew. But when that happens, it's a scary thing in terms of what it could mean for the client's lives, and certainly the cost as well, because as preventative medicine, we're a much cheaper factor than if we are the cleanup crew at the end of the issue. Yeah.
Yes, I agree. I think that really, as an adult, lawyers are some of the scariest people that you'll run into, particularly lawyers that know martial arts. I'm joking because I know that Fraser is avid at mixed martial arts and jiu-jitsu. But I really like that part of your practice where like I understand that everybody's seeking next levels somewhere. And the way that you've kind of taken like something like jiu-jitsu and talked to me about how you've practiced that in your mind, because they often associate strategy with law. A lot of people talk about chess, but they don't talk about the stress, right? And the stress of having these seemingly dire consequences must be so real in your job. How do you manage it?
Well, I go to the gym. I go to jujitsu to de-stress. But in terms of making sure that the stress doesn't get out of hand, it is really, again, front loading all the files that we do. As soon as we have someone come into the office, we need to know, okay, what's going on, what's the circumstances, because things get very stressful when we have a small window of time and we know that things should have been dealt with further in advance. And all lawyers will have situations where they're very busy or something happens. But in terms of real estate, because the deadlines are fixed, a lot of areas of law, they're fluid. We have a court date, there may be an adjournment, or we have a 2-year limitation period. So we're not in a rush to file a document anytime soon. But with real estate, because we know if your deal closed on March 31st, hell or high water, we must close on the 31st. So there is no option for that. So as a result, we want to make sure that if we can assess the situation in advance, we know where the stress points are going to be for us and for the client. And then if we're able to put our efforts into that well in anticipation of the problems arising, then even though it will be stressful to resolve those problems, we always have buffers built in place. If we want to make sure we want to see the client on Monday, but their schedules won't meet, and then for some reason we don't get to see them until Tuesday evening. Well, if the absolute last day we could see them was Thursday or Friday, we're still ahead by a few days. We've had clients call and cancel last minute because they have a life emergency or they have an issue that comes up, and we understand that. But building in the contingency in advance to ensure that we're not stressing the client and then stressing the deal is the best thing that we can do to ensure that things close smoothly.
I like that. And I really agree with it. Like the best cure is prevention, and being out front of that is such a meaningful part of the process. Now, when we talk about the different types of business that lawyers often do with families, this is actually where we introduce the amount of assets that would really start to justify making sure that you have a will. Now, wills and estates is something that you have a specialty in, and actually, that's another thing of your multi-generational law firm. This is an inherited specialty. Your mother is renowned when it comes to estate law.
Yeah, my mother, Janice Henderson Lypkie, was actually a member of the Law Firm Institute of Alberta for a long time. So she worked on making recommendations to the government for legislative reform. And when I was little, and I was interested in video games and playing hockey and soccer, that didn't mean a lot to me. But as I've gotten older, I've started to definitely appreciate, the insight she can provide. And when she was mentoring me as a young lawyer. And we deal with a lot of estates in our line of work. And when I joined the law firm, I was essentially told, you're going to get good at this because, eventually, you're going to be the one who's running it. So it was a really good introduction into dealing with estates, estate planning, estate administration, which is essentially what happens when somebody dies. You work your whole life to amass, a good retirement, a comfortable living, and you're going to have these assets, which when you die, you want them to go to particular people in particular manners. And that's essentially what we do. We want to know the goals of the client and then to how we can actually fulfill that within a legal framework that's going to reduce costs and time and stress on people's lives.
Yeah, I think that that's a kind of a key element because I'm not sure that everybody knows this, but you don't choose when that happens. Like all of a sudden, it's not like you can just hold off whatever happens at the end of your life. Like most of us will never know what it's going to be before it's there. And really to see how that has affected so many families, because that's actually a part of our business as well. We're
Mhm.
regularly taking part in that milestone for a family. Not all the milestones are positive ones.
Mhm.
We are just as often as we're celebrating with a young family that's upgrading, we're also shedding tears. Like I actually had a client that passed away this year, and we lost him. Selling his house was the last business he ever did.
Mhm.
In that case, we ended up having him sign the sale agreement, but when it came down to an amendment for removal of conditions, it was signed by the executor. And people don't see that part of real estate. They don't know that the police called me when he wasn't responding to his neighbors, and I was the person that drove and opened the house.
Mhm.
But when you're dealing with estates, you're often dealing with families that are in the middle of emotional turmoil. That's got to be incredibly challenging. And I see that you have such a calmness about yourself. It must really be an advantage there. But I've heard a rumor. I've heard that people that don't have very much assets or very many assets have trouble trusting the advice of professionals because it's new to them. And people that have many assets often find the estate process to be smoother because they follow advice right out of the gate.
Yeah, I'd say generally you hit the nail right on the head there. A lot of times when people have a few more assets, they've bought a house, they have dealt with employment issues, and maybe they have severance packages, and they've amassed, retirement savings. They've sought out the advice of professionals in advance, and so they're normally more comfortable with us. They've dealt with us before. They're used to an understanding of our services, and so commonly getting a will done in that context is old hat to them. They've been told by their parents, they've been told by their friends, get your will done. And there's usually some horror story someone's heard of. Oh, Joe died without a will, and then what happened? Well, he had a life insurance policy that went to, an old girlfriend they hadn't seen in 10 years, and she got all the money or something like that. And then people kind of get spooked and they come in to see us and they get stuff done. But it's usually a lot easier to deal with an estate when there's assets because it's a smoother process. You can set things up in advance. You deal with a lawyer. We give you the advice necessary to facilitate a smooth transaction. And when people are younger in particular, and we don't have as much to our name just yet, that's usually when people do not end up going through an estate planning process, even though most of us will buy a house in our 20s and 30s and we'll have something there. And if we've got insurance, there's usually still a good amount that's left over when we pass. I think a lot of people are quite surprised when they work with us. We go through their asset list, we break down what do you have, what do you own, what's your net amount. And usually, myself included, because life insurance is pretty cheap at my age, I'm worth quite a bit more dead than I am alive. And so, but when you pass away and there's no will, it creates a lot of ambiguity and it creates frustration amongst the family, particularly when if multiple people want to be in charge, or maybe for instance, if my dad wanted to be the executor, my mom said no, I'm going to be the better executor, and they're kind of fighting about that responsibility. We like to avoid those frustrations and friction points inside somebody's family by choosing the right person in advance, and that's what a good estate plan will do.
That's kind of a key element as well. And when we find that we're dealing with states, we also find that it's very important to make sure that everybody's getting the first clear message. Doing video has been such an advantage in our process to make sure that all the decision makers are getting information and it's not being filtered through relationships under the stress of loss. Uh,
Yes. Yeah.
that's a
There's a
big thing.
lot that goes into that emotional element. And we find that, particularly if we have an estate where there's no will and we might be looking into a situation of friction, those first couple of weeks will set the tone for a year or two long process. And especially, around the funeral, around other sort of things, everyone is sad and they're grieving in their own way. And some people may be angry at the loss of a child, or maybe at a parent who went too soon, or at a close, grandparent. And it is a very vital turning point of dealing with those matters amicably and hopefully to everybody's benefit. Because when people are grieving, it is the most emotionally charged thing that you can see someone go through, other than maybe a divorce. And as a result, if tempers flare at those situations when we're dealing with tough decisions, those wounds may not heal anytime soon. And so making sure that people are on the same page, communication is key. It sounds like the video conferencing would be an excellent thing to implement, especially amongst lawyers, because we're usually behind the letterhead and there's not a lot of emotion to those words. And those are things which certainly we see a problem if the right foot is not set forward in an estate matter.
Yeah, I could imagine that that's the case. Now, with that lesson of watching out for ambiguity and also those like almost like obsolete wills where
Mhm.
maybe your life has changed. How often would you recommend reviewing this?
We tell our clients, pull your will out and read through it at least every kind of 3 to 5 years. But that doesn't require a change, because a lot of times we get calls from clients who say, look, I'm going to pay you a lot of money to set up my will, and how often do I have to update this thing? Do I have to pay every year to deal with this? I mean, why do I want to engage in a service that they kind of view as almost like a yearly overhead allotment? And that's not certainly how it works. We want to future proof your will as much as possible, build in contingencies, build in different sort of elements to make sure you don't have to come back and change this on a regular basis. But you'll have a good gut reaction if you pull out your will and it just doesn't do what you want it to do. And for example, I did my first will when I was an articling student, which was a long time ago now. And then recently I had my first child, which was very exciting. And I looked at my will, and at the time it essentially said, if I pass, everything goes to my wife, and if my wife is not alive, then everything's going to go to my siblings. And so it was something which certainly is not going to work right now. And so that was a quick change to make sure. But I pulled it out just because, even though I deal with wills every day, I couldn't quite remember what my old one had said. And then I looked at it and I immediately thought, full stop, this is not going to work. It's not got to change. And so we've changed it, and now it'll include any children, going forward. And then, of course, another 5 years, I'll look at it again. And by then, in that case, I probably won't make another change, because usually it's get your first one done when you're a young parent, get your second one done when you're sort of a retiree and your children are old enough now to be your executor, something along those lines. And then you might do it again when you have grandkids. That's a pretty common theme, but it's still good to look at it, because it's big life changes, which are why you would need to redo your will, things like a divorce or maybe moving to a different province, stuff like that. Those are good reasons to update the documentation.
Well, we've definitely seen what picking up the pieces looks like, where it's unclear and it looks like it's going to be a long and arduous process. So it's great that you're helping people avoid that. As many people are going to be approaching the market to buy property, and you were mentioning that your first will was done back when you were articling, at what point should you really consider getting a will?
I would say when you have a major asset, that's a good triggering point. There's a number of different reasons to get a will, but one of the biggest one is just appointing an executor. The reason for that is your will speak actually from the day that you die. So if I pass away tomorrow, my executor has authorities to deal with my affairs immediately. There are still different legalities that must be obtained in order to sell major assets like a bank and things like that. A house, and then deal with bank accounts. But if you end up having the will, then at least the show can get started a little bit faster. Whereas if you don't have a will, then we have to wait many months until we have a court order appointing someone essentially to handle the estate's affairs. So we've even had young clients in their early 20s getting a will done because they don't own a lot. But if something did happen to them, they want their parents to be able to just administer their affairs as easily as possible. But once you have a major asset, then I would say it's really time to deal with this to make sure that you have the right person handling your affairs, you know where it's going to go to. Because you might put every last penny you have into getting that right down payment, furnish your house, have a nice place, and then, who knows where it's going to go if you pass away. And also, it's more of a good reason if you have maybe an abnormal person you want to give it to. For instance, if you pass away without a will, it's probably going to be that the estate goes to your nearest family member, but maybe your family, you don't like them, or maybe they have enough money and you want it to go to a good friend of yours or something. And if you want those types of goals to be met, then you need to get a will done. But commonly, buy a house, get a will. That's a pretty good motto, just to make sure that what you've put into that will go to the right party.
Well, never want to hinge on anything that would be detailed, but I have to say that some of the estates that I've been part of have been beautiful when there's an unconventional beneficiary. It's amazing to think that the extraordinary things that are done by normal people.
Yeah, absolutely. And one of the nice things to think about in terms of doing a will is obviously no one wants to think about their own death. We don't want to think that we're not going to be here one day on this world enjoying things that we enjoy. But there can be a lot of impact you can make on someone's life with your estate. And sometimes that is what we talk about clients with, because they may say, well, I don't have any kids or I don't have a spouse and I don't know where I want to leave this to. And my parents, they're set, they have money. And then they started to think about some of their friends who maybe had a tough time in life. They lost a job because of COVID, or maybe someone got sick. And it is something where you can leave to people which it will enhance their life, your estate. And sometimes you don't have to leave it all to them. You can leave a portion of it to them. But I've seen people who've been given, $5,000, $10,000, something which is not a small amount of money, but it's not $1 million, make a massive change in someone's life. It can help pay them off their debts. It can help them sort of get that deposit on a house. Whereas, not that it's insignificant, but someone who's in their 60s or 70s, they get some inheritance from their parents, their life's probably not changing. It's still great that they got that inheritance, their parents wanted them to get it. But usually, people in a tougher spot, or if they're in a situation where they never expected this money to come across their desk, that's really where it's a shock, and it means a lot to those people. And it's a nice thing to see is sometimes those gifts be given to those individuals because you can really see the appreciation on their face. And it can be a life-changing circumstance in many situations.
Man, that's really good insight. I appreciate that. And that's exactly what we're looking for when we talk about trusted expert insight. This is Fraser Lypkie of Lypkie Law, and we can find you on the internet. You can also easily find him on our trusted expert list. My name is Taylor. I'm with Hack&Co at Remax River City, and we want to put information like this available so that we can make sure that education can start somewhere easily. And then you can get in touch with someone like Fraser, whether it is real estate or wills and estates. You offer other services from your law firm as well.
Yeah, my brother Tyler is the other partner here at the firm, and he helps individuals who've been dismissed from work with employment, severance negotiations. We also deal with things such as adult guardianship and trusteeship, corporate commercial, of course, real estate, and wills and estates. Those are sort of our focused pillars of advice, and we try to stick to those so we're good at what we do.
Have no doubt in that. We've had a great experience working along with you, and that's why we list you among our trusted experts. So thanks again for coming and chatting. I really appreciate it because this is a good way for me to get legal advice without the invoice.
Absolutely. And we're always happy to chat.
Yeah, actually, that's one of the most meaningful things is I don't think that most people realize how often our teammates are calling through to people like yourself to make sure that what we're writing down at the time of purchase is something that's going to be that preventative maintenance. And I think that that's actually the imprint that your father's left on me. So I really appreciate that with being part of kind of that community of experts. That's something that has not only benefited our clients, but also us.
Yeah, and we appreciate those calls. It's one of those things where we always used to say, if we're at our desk, we do pick up the phone. We promise that. And it's nice to get in touch with people ahead of time so we can make those future problems as smooth as possible.
Awesome. Well, thanks again. And for everyone joining us, we really appreciate you watching, and we will see you next time. Cheers.
Absolutely. Pleasure.